The meeting began with a handshake, one that's likely to infuriate a Chinese government vehemently opposed to any official U.S. recognition of Taiwan. More than a dozen U.S. lawmakers accompanied Speaker Kevin McCarthy, signaling that congressional support for Taiwan is completely bipartisan.
This is not a Republican or Democrat. This is a bipartisan meeting of members of Congress who are honored to spend some time with you and to discuss the important issues of moving forward.
The Taiwanese leader thanked the lawmakers.
Their presence and unwavering support reassure the people of Taiwan that we are not isolated and we are not alone.
The Biden administration attempted to get ahead of any Chinese retaliation for the meeting.
So our channels of communications are open, and we have had a consistent message that has urged restraint. And in recent days, we have conveyed directly to the Chinese at high levels that escalation is uncalled for.
Last month, the U.S. State Department approved a potential sale of more than $600 million worth of weapons to Taiwan, including missiles for its F-16 fighters. This in the wake of a diplomatic dispute about what the U.S. insisted were Chinese spy balloons and the subsequent postponement of a scheduled visit to China by the U.S. Secretary of State. And now a high-level meeting on U.S. soil that could be yet another blow to the normalization of relations the U.S. insists it wants. Mike Hanna, Al Jazeera, Washington.
This meeting between Taiwan's President Tsai Ing-wen and U.S. officials in Taipei has high political implications. The government says it needs international support as threats from China get louder and closer.
I would like to reiterate that the people of Taiwan love democracy, seek peace, and are keen to fulfill their responsibility in the international community.
China considers Taiwan as part of its territory and has not ruled out using force to take it. The U.S. says it's ready to expedite weapon sales.
As the House Foreign Affairs Committee Chairman, I sign off on all foreign military sales, including weapons to Taiwan. And I promise you, Madam President, we will deliver those weapons.
Now China has launched 3 days of military exercises around Taiwan, a response to the Taiwanese president meeting earlier this week with U.S. House Speaker Kevin McCarthy. Taiwan's fighter jets responded with their own drills as fears grow about a possible escalation.
It will be interesting to see just exactly how far the Chinese are prepared to push this. If they do stop and inspect ships in the Taiwan Strait and the Taiwanese say, no, we're not going to comply, then there's the potential then for that to escalate into some sort of exchange of fire.
But China remains defiant.
The Taiwan issue is not about democracy. It's an issue concerning China's sovereignty and territorial integrity. Taiwan is an inalienable part of our country.
Taiwan understands it needs international backing, especially from the United States. The question is whether it will be enough to deter Beijing. Katia Lopez-Adoyan, Al Jazeera.
Taiwan's defense ministry has reported 9 Chinese warships and 58 aircraft around the island on Sunday. Chinese state media say the military is practicing an encirclement of the island during a second day of drills. The operation was announced in response to Taiwanese President Tsai Ing-wen's visit to the U.S. Victoria Gatenby has more.
A Taiwanese Coast Guard vessel issues a warning to a Chinese warship taking part in drills in the Taiwan Strait.
You are now seriously damaging regional peace, stability, and safety. Please turn around immediately and leave.
On Saturday, the Defense Ministry reported that 70 Chinese jets crossed the median line of the Taiwan Strait, the unofficial barrier between the two sides. Beijing says the military is rehearsing an encirclement of the self-governing island, which it sees as a breakaway province. The 3-day exercise follows Taiwanese President Tsai Ing-wen's visit to the U.S. In the capital, Taipei, people go about their daily lives. Many say they fluctuate between fear and indifference.
The president travelling to different countries has the effect of increasing international awareness of Taiwan. Of course, verbal and military intimidation from China can't be avoided, but I think because this intimidation has been going on for such a long time, it's impossible to ignore.
China considers Taiwan part of its territory and has not ruled out using force to take it. But Taiwanese consider themselves independent and reject the one country, two systems policy.
To constantly talk about unification is quite unnecessary, or rather, there is no absolute need for this. Also, China is talking about unification while threatening military action, which is quite pointless. I think it's more important for us to live our lives as we are currently and have Taiwan achieve a bigger position on the international stage.
The military drills have disrupted shipping and air traffic in a region crucial to global trade. More worrying, perhaps, Beijing is turning up the heat on another simmering conflict. Victoria Gatenby, Al Jazeera.
Well, let's speak to Vincent Chow in Taipei about this. He's a former foreign policy aide to President Tsai Ing-wen and is now a Taipei city councillor. Thank you very much, Vincent, for joining us on Al Jazeera. So we have China simulating striking Taiwan on a second day of drills. Now, interestingly, as we saw in our report, Taiwan's residents seem unfazed by these latest maneuvers. Why is that? Why are people seemingly not as concerned in Taiwan?
Well, thank you for having me. And the truth of the matter is that the people of Taiwan have bravely faced this sort of threat from China consistently over the past 2 to 3 years now. We've seen consistent military action across the Taiwan Strait. We've seen, for example, the Chinese engage in naval and air force drills in Taiwan's vicinity. We've seen economic actions and sanctions against Taiwan. And this has unfortunately been part and parcel of the cross-strait relationship under Xi Jinping from China.
But these exercises are simulating striking Taiwan. I mean, how do they compare to China's response last year when the U.S. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi visited Taiwan?
I would argue that last year we saw a bit of an increased escalation from what the Chinese have done in the past. I don't think we've seen this over the past 2 years. I mean, certainly the Chinese have never made their intentions more clear, which is that they have never renounced the use of force against Taiwan, and exercises pretending to strike Taiwan or to storm Taiwan's government offices. We've seen this in the past as well. So I do think that the Chinese are being a bit more restrained this time around, but it's also for their own self-interest in a sense that we do have a presidential election coming up, and the Chinese would be mindful that any hard-headed approach on this issue could very well backfire in terms of their political interests here in Taiwan.
I was going to ask you about the presidential election in 2024. What does the future hold for Taiwan? What impact is China's assertiveness, increasing assertiveness over Taiwan, going to have on the vote and independence ambitions?
So I think for President Tsai, although she's term limited and will not participate in the 2024 election, she's always been very clear-headed in terms of what Taiwan needs. Taiwan needs a robust defense, so she's committed to that. She's increased the defense budget by a third over her term. She's reintroduced conscription. She's re-envisioned our military strategy to a more asymmetric style. And so that's part of it. But the second part of it is precisely what she was doing across the United States in recent days, which is just broaden Taiwan's international space. China, for a very long time, has seen conflict as part of this internal conflict between the Chinese Communist Party and previously the Kuomintang of Taiwan. And so certainly I think it is in Taiwan's interest, in President Tsai's interest, to internationalize this issue and hopefully to have other democracies step in and have a stake in enforcing peace and stability here.
You talk about internationalizing the issue, but at the same time, we've seen Taiwan lose a number of diplomatic allies, 9, in fact, since Tsai Ing-wen became president. So wouldn't you see it perhaps also that Taiwan is increasingly becoming isolated on the international stage?
I would argue the opposite. I mean, we have had a number of diplomatic allies in the past that are smaller countries around the world in the Pacific, Caribbean, that have continuously advocated for Taiwan internationally. I think that's important. But, you know, what's very important and what's more essential for Taiwan's security are relations with the United States, with Europe, with Japan, with Australia, and other potential democratic partners around the world. And so these are the issues that are going to keep peace and stability here, not the number of diplomatic allies Taiwan has.
Vincent Chow, thank you very much for talking to us.
Thank you.
French President Emmanuel Macron being given the honor of a state visit welcome by his Chinese counterpart, Xi Jinping. One of Europe's most influential leaders coming to ask China to exert its influence on Russia to bring an end to Europe's worst conflict since World War II.
I know that I can count on you to bring Russia to reason and everyone to the negotiating table.
This was Xi Jinping visiting Russian President Vladimir Putin last month. Since Moscow's invasion more than a year ago, Beijing has stayed neutral and proposed a roadmap for a ceasefire and peace talks. Most Western leaders, including Macron, have criticized the plan, but the French president has been one of the more conciliatory voices among NATO heads of state. 2 weeks before Russia's invasion, he met President Vladimir Putin in the Kremlin and has spoken to him several times by phone over the past year. Many are now watching to see if Macron and Xi together can provide a breakthrough where others have failed.
China insists on a peaceful resolution and is willing to work with France to maintain the rationality of the international community and avoid actions that could further escalate the crisis or let things get out of control.
In a show of European unity, Macron is accompanied by European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, who has taken a much tougher line on China's failure to condemn the Russian invasion. The Europeans are looking at the very least to dissuade China from supplying Russia with arms.
We also count on China not to provide any military equipment directly or indirectly to Russia, because we all know arming the aggressor would be against international law and it would significantly harm our relationship.
The signing of lucrative trade deals on this trip is seen as Beijing's attempt to maintain good European relations, even as ties with the US sour.
I hope China will tell President Macron on the one hand, and then tell Madame von der Leyen on the other hand, that it is absolutely important to have a European perspective, which may or may not be exactly identical to that of the United States.
Chinese and European leaders hoping traditionally strong trade links can lead to a diplomatic breakthrough. Rob McBride, Al Jazeera.
I speak to Andy Mock. He's a senior research fellow at the Centre for China and Globalisation think tank. He joins us now live from Beijing. Thank you for joining the programme. French leader Emmanuel Macron has urged the Chinese President Xi Jinping to help stop Russia's war in Ukraine. How optimistic are you that China can do that, given the Kremlin has already said there are no prospects for a peaceful settlement and that its offensive will continue?
Well, of course, a party to this, and it is. So China, of course, is not a party to this conflict, and it is actually quite geographically removed from it as well. That being said, of course, China has an interest in having a peaceful resolution to this conflict, and I think that's been China's position all along, and it has maintained a position of neutrality as well that I think positions it well to be an intermediary to bring this conflict
you say China
conclusion.
is trying to remain neutral. That's not really the case, is it? Because on the one hand, it's openly stated that it's a big supporter of Russia. It's not condemned the war in Ukraine. But on the other hand, it's playing this big role of international mediator. Surely it can't have it both ways.
Well, it's certainly not having it both ways. And I think we have to separate the conflict with the relationship with the parties to the conflict. So China certainly has a strong relationship with Russia. It has relationships with every country, almost every country in the world. So I think it's important to make this distinction, first of all. And China clearly has not taken a side in this conflict, as some countries have that claim to want to bring this to a peaceful conclusion, and yet fan the fires of conflict by providing arms to the participants of this conflict. So I would maybe not completely agree with your statement there that China's trying to have it both ways. In fact, it is the only country that has not taken a position in this conflict.
EU relations with China are increasingly being dictated by the Ukraine conflict rather than economic cooperation. How much will that be playing on China's mind?
Well, it's not either or. So these are related issues, opportunities, problems. But they're also distinct as well. So the conflict in Ukraine, of course, has a very direct impact on European security, global security more broadly. But these are separate issues. And I think China's also approaching this with France, with other European countries, as demonstrating commitment to resolving the Ukraine conflict peacefully, but also deepening and strengthening trade and investment ties with Europe.
I appreciate your time. Andy Mock, Senior Research Fellow at the Center for China and Globalization think tank, speaking to us there from Beijing.
Shortly after the raid, rockets were fired into southern Israel from Gaza. Israel then carried out airstrikes on the besieged Palestinian enclave. Al Jazeera's Yumna El Sayed reports from Gaza.
The Israeli airstrikes were on the military sites belonging to Hamas in different areas in the Gaza Strip. There was only material damage in these military sites as they were empty. They're used to be emptied once there is any kind of escalation that is predicted or any tension. No casualties or injuries were reported. Of course, in retaliation of the airstrikes, and while they were still going on, barrages of rockets were launched from the Gaza Strip as well, and that response in retaliation between the Israeli army and the Palestinian factions in Gaza stayed for a while in the early hours of Wednesday today. They were then strong international and Egyptian mediations taking place. They seem to have been successful to restore the calm back to the Gaza Strip. We have not witnessed any launching of rockets or airstrikes in the past couple of hours. Hamas on its side, with many statements through many of its officials abroad and in Gaza, said and confirmed that this Israeli aggression is unprecedented, and it's a serious shift, as it has been called, in the Israeli aggression towards Al-Aqsa Mosque and the worshippers. They've called on the Palestinian people to resist and to fight back with all their tools this Israeli aggression and crimes.
Israel vowed a tough response, and after midnight it came. Fighter jets launching a series of airstrikes on the besieged Gaza Strip. It came on day of spiraling tensions. On Thursday afternoon, rockets were fired from southern Lebanon into Israel. It was the largest barrage since the 2006 war. Most were intercepted by the Iron Dome defense system, but not all. Several buildings were damaged and at least 3 people injured. Israel's prime minister scrambled his security cabinet and warned of retaliation.
We have no intention of changing the status quo on the Temple Mount. We are calling for calming the situation, and we will take strong action against extremists who use violence there. Regarding the aggression against us on other fronts, we will strike our enemies, and they will pay the price for any act of aggression.
The attack in northern Israel came amid heightened tensions in occupied East Jerusalem. The focal point, Al-Aqsa Mosque compound. For 2 days straight, Israeli forces entered the mosque and fired stun grenades and rubber-coated steel bullets to clear worshippers out. Police say they wanted to remove them before Jews could enter the compound during the hours allowed for non-Muslims. But Palestinians decry the excessive use of force and say Israel is attempting to change the status quo. Jordan, which is the custodian of Islam's third holiest site, decried Israel's action.
Israel's unjustified aggression against peaceful worshippers in Al-Aqsa Mosque is a push toward escalation and a violation of the sanctuary of the holy places. It also violates all international norms and Israel's responsibility as the occupying forces. Violence breeds violence.
The images of Israeli forces attacking worshippers inside the mosque has infuriated many Palestinians. Skirmishes have erupted in several Arab towns inside Israel. On Thursday night, a Jewish settler opened fire on Palestinians in occupied East Jerusalem. Here in Gaza, Palestinians are braced for a night of Israeli bombardment, but there is a fear of what is to come, with calls for de-escalation going unheeded. Yumna Syed, Al Jazeera, Gaza.
Tens of thousands of Israelis have taken to the streets again to protest against the government's plans to overhaul the judicial system. They say their country, under the most right-wing government in Israel's history, is becoming a dictatorship.
Because they're racists, they are extremists, they're a lot like a Taliban, even worse, because they're racists. And as long as they are in power, nothing good can come out of it.
The Israeli government has proposed changes to allow a simple majority of 61 in the 120-seat Knesset to override almost any Supreme Court ruling. The plan also enables politicians to appoint the majority of the judges in the Supreme Court. The proposal has ignited months of demonstrations. Critics say it will destroy the checks and balances and the separation of power. These anti-government protests against the proposed judicial changes are the largest in Israel's history. Israeli right-wing government has issued warnings and called people not to attend the protest because of the security concerns. But protesters here say the government is responsible for the crisis and there won't be security without democracy. Saturday protests came days after Israeli police stormed Al-Aqsa Mosque, the third holiest site for Muslims, and forcefully removed overnight Palestinian worshippers on Wednesday. Israeli occupation forces also injured tens of Palestinians and arrested around 400 in the mosque. Many protesters here say the government is deliberately triggered a security crisis to stop the protest.
It's all part of creating chaos because he's trying to diverse everything from his real situation in court. He will do everything that on his power to escape from trial because he knows, and he's selling the country, he's selling the people. It's the most extreme people that are sitting right now in the government, and it's a nightmare.
On March 27, Prime Minister Netanyahu posed a proposal after protests paralyzed the country, but he declined to withdraw it completely. Shame, shame, the protesters chant. They say they will not stop until Netanyahu's government is gone. Rasul Serdar, Al Jazeera, Tel Aviv.
These pictures show the extent of damage in Peru's northern region of Piura. Roads filled with water and cars submerged. People struggle to save their valuables, and many say they've received no help.
We're practically abandoned. We need help and support. Because look, the Gala ravine has overflowed, and that is what had affected all of us. Imagine we have children. The children have to put up with all this.
After days of heavy rain, many are struggling to come to terms with their losses.
My animals have died. They're floating all around. Everything. My sandals, my water, my food, my wardrobe, my mattress. Everything has filled with water.
Unusually warm sea waters and a cyclone in recent weeks have led to record high water levels. Inadequate drainage is being blamed for worsening the floods. Drinking water and electricity supplies have been cut off in many areas. Schools, offices and commercial buildings have been damaged, and many fear their homes are no longer safe.
We're leaving momentarily because if we had another house to go to, we would leave for good.
President Dina Boluarte has declared a state of emergency and affected regions are on high alert. As survivors fight to save what they have left, forecasters say more rains are on their way. Rahila Mohammed, Al Jazeera.
The return and reunion of 31 children with their families is a victory for careful and complicated negotiations to secure their release. In many cases held against their will for months, child protection workers believe their stories will help prove the International Criminal Court's case against Russian President Vladimir Putin and his Children's Rights Commissioner, Maria Lvova-Belova.
How were they deported, what happened in their camps, how they were relocated, because it's kidnapping. All of this, it is destroying their Ukrainian identity. It is a war crime and genocide.
16-year-old Vitaly was sent with his parents' consent to a Russian health camp in October last year. It was meant to be a 2-week break from the hardships of occupied Kherson. It turned into a 6-month ordeal before Vitaly finally saw his family again in March.
The first 2 weeks were normal, but after 3 weeks, I started to look for every possibility to go home.
Vitaly says he was among more than 800 Ukrainian children at just one camp, homesick, often scared, and at times, he says, placed in a detention cell for days as punishment for transgressions.
They fed us porridge, without salt and sugar, 3 times a day. Every evening they spoke to us about politics. They would say Russia is a powerful country and Ukraine is a terrorist one.
The International Criminal Court says it's identified hundreds of cases of children allegedly forcibly taken from care homes and orphanages in Ukraine, deported, it says, with the intention of permanently removing them from their country of birth. That's a violation of the Geneva Convention, it says, and a war crime. Ukraine insists the practice is much wider, saying it's identified more than 19,500 cases of forced deportations, including many, like Vitaly, taken with parental permission under false pretenses, instead enduring months of indoctrination and propaganda. Daria Kazyanova has helped reunite 84 children with their families by providing the Russians with proof of legal guardianship. I put to her a video that Russia's Children's Commissioner recently showed to UN Security Council members. It purports to show happy Ukrainian children, some receiving medical care, others placed in foster care.
This is part of an information war. These pictures of children living in safety. It's such a manipulation, using children as objects, not subject to rights, trying to construct a different reality.
Russia admits to the removal of 2,000 Ukrainian children from occupied areas in the conflict zone, but presents it as a humanitarian effort. The ICC calls it a war crime, and one Ukraine says is taking place on a far bigger scale in plain sight. Jonah Hull, Al Jazeera, Kyiv.
This airport in Argentina's capital is filled with homeless people. It's a snapshot of an economic crisis that's getting worse. The Buenos Aires Jorge Newbery Airport has become an unofficial shelter for people like Laura.
There's a lot of us sleeping here. In a few hours there'll be more. If you come at night, it's full of people. We come here because it's cold out. Here at least we can sleep.
Roxana gets a government pension of about $200 a month. With an unexpected exchange rate, she often ends up with less. One local charity says the number of people without a roof over their heads has soared 30% since 2019.
If I pay rent, I don't eat. And if I pay for food, I'm on the street.
Argentina's annual inflation reached more than 100% in February. People have faced double-digit inflation for years, but this is the first time since 1991 it's been in triple digits. The frustration is growing. Earlier this week, protesters demanded a salary increase in line with the rising cost of living. Families say a government deal to restructure its $45 billion loan with the International Monetary Fund has yet to filter down and make a difference. Back at the airport, Argentinians like Elizabeth say they feel forced to leave.
I'm going to France. I found a job there. Here the situation is difficult. My salary is not enough to pay rent. It doesn't matter how much they raise my salary. Inflation is too high.
She's among thousands of Argentinians who've decided to leave, hoping one day, if things get better, to fly to that same airport and get back home. Katia Lopez Odoyan, Al Jazeera.